Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone for joining. My name's Lian Rowlands. I'm here in sunny Leeds this morning, joined by a very exclusive panel. And we're here to launch the Forenet and Contact Babel report on AI, voice, vulnerability, and what that means in the world of CX. Our panelists we've got today are Kevin Still, we've got James Brooks, we've got Owen Campbell, and we've got Steve Morrell joining us from Contact Babel. I'm just going to go around the room, actually ask everyone to introduce themselves. So Kev, can you go first?
Yeah, I wear a couple of hats. I'm here as director of a trade body that works in the debt sector. I'm non-exec director for the Vulnerability Registration Service, and I sit on groups like HM Treasury Fairness Group and the Standard Financial Statement, Money Advice and Money and Pension Service rather. So a number of different perspectives around vulnerability.
Thanks, Kev. James?
James Brooks, I'm the Head of Practice for AI and Automation at Forenet.
Owen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Owen, I'm the Chief Exec for Cura, a BPO operating in the financial services and utility sectors.
And Steve?
Yep, hi, Steve Morrell, Managing Director of Contact Babel. We produce a lot of contact center and CX research free of charge.
Fabulous. Thanks, everybody. So at the moment, the research tells us that nearly half of UK adults can currently be classed at some point in their life as vulnerable. But I think lots of people have different views in terms of what vulnerability actually means and how it's defined. And Kev, this is probably more for you as a starting point, really, which is in 2026 currently, with all of the new legislation that's coming through and the conversations, how do we define vulnerability? What is it at this point?
Okay, I mean, vulnerability's been around for quite a while, and what I would like to start is a few positives, if we can do. The vulnerability agenda is pretty mature in the global sense, really, from the UK with Consumer Duty, and that's evolved over the last decade. But that's not to say there's not a lot of work to be done. So many of the rules we're talking about have been around since 2014, and it's only really in recent years with things like COVID, cost of living crisis, that this has become much more of a cross-sector challenge, particularly around things like Tell Me Once and the agenda there. So what we've seen is a series of disparate initiatives in the public sector with energy, but probably the one that is right at the forefront is the Financial Conduct Authority around the Consumer Duty, and the vulnerability guidance that came out in February 2021 was reviewed last March with significantly a view from the FCA that no changes are required. What had to happen was the firms needed to step up to the plate and up their own performance. So what we've seen really at the start of this year is joint statements from the Information Commissioner's Office, the FCA, and broadly one of the key messages from that was data protection shouldn't stand in the way of actually dealing with people that have got characteristics of vulnerability. And that evolution is vulnerability is not binary. So the things we'll talk about today is that for those that register with things like the Vulnerability Registration Service, typically they've got 5 vulnerabilities. And if you look at one of those often being financial resilience, so of the 4 categories, life events, financial resilience, capability, including English not language, and health, often it's a permutation of those. So that definition's really been around since 2021. And many of the other regulators like Ofgem on the energy side, Ofwat on the water side, and with Treasury, as I said, all beginning to align in terms of what they actually mean. And then for those that were late to the party, local authorities, council tax, enforcement agents, they've all got new standards that have got to be adopted by January 27. So there is a lot of activity. But a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today relates to events this year. In particular, for many of the financial services firms and BPOs that work for them, they are required to produce a board report every July. And just last week, I was written to by the FCA in my trade body hat, thankfully. Here are the 4 things that they identified. One was data quality, so the foundations of this are good quality data, but in particular, dealing with people with customers with characteristics of vulnerability. Okay. Secondly, customer analysis. How are you segmenting your information to different customer cohorts? So not a one size fits all. actions and ownership, which is particularly important. The board need to be more accountable. The people that are running some of these change programs, there need to be evidence more in these reports. And then finally, within the board challenges, that they are challenging the business. Most of them have decided to keep their duty champion, so there's some ownership. So when James talks about AI, the FCA have issued an AI in financial services guide.
Yeah.
Same time, we've got things building on DORA around operational resilience, which includes definitions of intolerable harm. So if we think about that relative to banks' services going down on payday, what could possibly go wrong if you can't receive your money, your pay, and pay out on your direct debits? Similarly, when there's a water outage or an energy outage, what could possibly go wrong when people haven't got their supply? And if they've got the Internet of Things, and they may have a pacemaker or a dialysis machine. So somebody can transition very quickly from being probably potentially vulnerable into an acute state of vulnerability. So that transitional, transient state is just as important here. Now that's got to then translate down to the front line. So two of the big things that really happened now in the third year of reporting is, have you trained your staff?
Yeah.
How are you using AI to assist some of those staff? That fits into QA frameworks, where often just assessing 4 calls per month per advisor doesn't cut it anymore.
Yep.
And how do you assure the board that this supervision or risk of consumer detriment is being managed? So evidence is key.
Yep.
And thinking beyond MI dashboards is key.
So these are not just tick box exercises anymore. These are not just about being compliant from a paper perspective. These are about
quite the opposite.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
So thinking outside of the box, which I think the guys will talk about today, and I think for consumers, the thing I would stress now is trust.
Yeah.
More than anything else, as we see consumer adoption of AI, there's a high adoption by consumers, but there's a low level of trust in the firms, the corporations, in terms of their motives.
Yeah.
And where I would make a clear distinction is, if you're in financial services, for example, and you've got a customer paying for your service, there should be no excuse for long wait times. Now, if you happen to be the UK's tax collector, or you happen to be a water company and you're committed to supply, you may have differences of view in terms of what an acceptable level of service is.
Yeah.
But for those where consumers are paying, there is really no hiding place anymore to have your call is important to us, but we're experiencing exceptionally high volume.
Understood. Thanks, Kev. So moving on to the report then, we've got Steve with us, Steve from Contact Babel. Obviously, you're the author of this report. We've worked together on it with Fournette. It's probably a good time now for you to let's dig into that and take a look at what it actually says and what the data is actually telling us.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, right, so the report's called Beyond Compliance, AI for Vulnerable Customers. It's based on research with over 200 UK contact centres. It's the first time we've looked in depth at vulnerability. So it's been, some very interesting things, and this is something we're looking to build on in the future. So I'll just kind of, I realise, there's a lot of people on this call, so we're going to be quite pushed for time. So I'm not going to labour some of the data. So let's just move on and have a quick look at the top lines here. So the first question we asked is, how important to your organisation is improving the support of vulnerable customers, which I was very pleased to see that almost everybody thought was, either important, if not critically important. And it's interesting that every survey respondent from the FS, housing, insurance and medical sectors stated it was of critical importance. And everybody, every contact centre with more than 50 seats said it was either important or critically important. So that's good news for this webinar. It means that we're on the right track talking about this. So let's have a look about how AI is being used to support vulnerable customers at the moment. And the answer is not very much, as, to be honest, as we might expect. Public sector finances say they're most likely to be using it, but really we are at the foot of the mountain on this. People are just learning, what ways can we do this? And, what are the various use cases for this, which the report looks at and we'll obviously be talking about later. Big plans for it. 27% say they're going to implement in the next few months, because that's where we are, April already. And there's only 30% that aren't currently considering using this. So this is, what a typical thing we see. This is kind of early adopters are using AI for this. So if you're not using it at the moment, don't worry, you haven't missed the boat. So the report itself looks at 4 key discussion points, and we're going to break those down and have a chat about those, each of them now. So firstly, isn't telephony dead? The second thing, how do we identify vulnerability? How can we use AI for that? How can we balance customer care with the KPIs, which we know are still important? Things like your cost is obviously vitally important. And where does the agent fit into this? That's a big one. What's the agent's role in this? It's not all about technology. It's how do we help agents to help customers? So look at the first element of this first. Is telephony dead? The death of voice. And we're very strongly of the view that it is not. Chart on the left shows the questions we've been asking since 2018 to our base of 1,000 customers, saying in these circumstances, which channel do you go to first? And what you can see there is the telephony for issues of high emotion, high complexity, and high urgency. And high emotion does tend to be along the telephony lines. We've seen growth in high complexity and high urgency as well. So what that chart there says is that telephony, from the customer's perspective, if anything, is becoming even more important. And if we look at the right hand side there, we can see that exactly telephony is super important by age range as well, depending. Also email for high emotion. When we're really digging into things, it's the high complexity that we see people really leaning into the idea that live telephony is best. And that is something, if we're going to be using AI and automation, that we kind of need to address with customers and make them, give them the experience that AI and automation can be positive. It can actually be better than necessarily going for live telephony, because that's where people's mindset is at the moment. They think live telephony is the gold standard. Can we do anything about that? Or is that just something we have to accept?
That's really interesting. I find that really fascinating. I think the reports of the death of telephony have been vastly overstated for about the last 15 years. I think people have been suggesting that telephony is a channel that's dying, and actually we're seeing increased across different reasons for contact. We're seeing different increases in reliance on telephony. I'm actually going to come to you first, Kev, on that, which is that report. The report itself is very clear on the importance of voice. And it talks about voice being the gold standard. Do you think voice is still the gold standard? And do you think, in terms of the legislation and everything that you're seeing come through from that perspective, is there space for other channels, other ways to actually really reinforce how we deal and improve in how we deal with vulnerability?
Yeah, the caveat here is if done well. Yeah. So if done well, I think it is the gold standard in conjunction with things like AI-assisted tooling, where that may be a mixed journey. But I think particularly now, and I think we've got to be clear here, a lot of people in contact centres are not the best paid people in the world. So expecting somebody on minimum wage often to actually know or be knowledgeable around some of the things we're talking about today is quite a tall order. So you've got to enhance that knowledge. You also got to understand where the handoffs are, and you've got to make sure that those people are readily available. So human in the loop is really important. Having access and good response times. Many of the things, the detriment occurs before you speak to the human being. If you get stuck in an IVR queue with 500,000 different permutations. So it is the end-to-end journey. Telephony is important. You've got to arm the people with the right information on it, and you've got to set the right expectations. So where I would say in some of the work I do within the AI space is, if you turn around and you look at some of the call waiting times, often I would turn around and say, if that's going to be 53 minutes, would you prefer to speak to an AI bot? Because you may be able to deal with your tax code change or a small change. Yep. And some of those may be quite critical to that individual. So all of the things you've just seen in that graph, whether it's complex, high emotion, yep, all of those things can fit into that. But you can become anxious very quickly before you ever speak to the human being. So I agree with a caveat, gold standard, very important, but you've got to live up to your promise.
Absolutely. And that's always a challenge, right? Because the availability of agents is always going to be a challenge, particularly in peaks and troughs of service and particular times of year and
Times a day.
times of day. Absolutely, 100%. But James, what alternatives have we got? Maybe not alternatives, but what in terms of what you're looking at, what you're seeing in your role within Fornet as in the digital transformation space, what opportunities have we got to either augment the customer journey, to augment the vulnerability, the journey of these customers, or to augment the agent journey as well to assist them in terms of what Kev was just saying then?
I think there's a host of things. I think picking up on what you said, Kev, around kind of wait time specifically, there's a more radical idea in that potentially all inbound voice should be converted to outbound via appointments, by callback appointments. And you use the AI to do that. So it would then free up your ability to, if you do have an immediate requirement, to get through to an agent, because agents have been automatically scheduled to deal with the callbacks that they're highest skilled in. So we have this idea of accuracy over immediacy. So the AI should be very good at identifying your reason for contact, identifying if you have an immediate need to speak to someone, in which case the AI can fast track you through to a person. But if you don't, then AI can potentially be your first port of call. So you don't necessarily give customers, members of the public that don't have an immediate need, the option to speak to a human agent to begin with. The AI will try and resolve your issues, and if it can't, then book an appointment with someone who is almost guaranteed, a specialist in your particular issue, and will call you back at your convenience. You set the appointment that way.
So, Lian, on that one, that knowledge or memory of previous dialogue is critical.
Absolutely, yeah.
So even if you're using caller line identification, for example, and particularly in the space I'm in with regard to inclusive design, if you've already identified somebody with characteristics of vulnerability, and you may internally, and that there is a standard ISO 22458 for those that are interested, which is inclusive design, you may set different response times, and particularly where you're an essential service provider, which may say, I want to answer the phone in 30 seconds, and I want to direct them. But because I can identify that caller on the main line and direct them, that's where you can use some of the technology that James is talking about.
Yeah. So it's about finding the right interactions and doing the right thing for the requirement of the right interactions and the right people at that point in time.
But that memory, even if it's just in your organisation, just that distribution chain is vital. That's probably one of the biggest annoyances that I've been forgotten and I only called you 5 days ago.
So this comes back to the tell me once, doesn't it?
It's the
starting point of tell me once. I'm actually going to come to Owen now, because obviously, you're at Cura, you're working with lots of different organisations. How well do you think most of the organisations, not necessarily the ones you work with, but the ones you talk to and the ones you speak to, how well do you think they're set up to actually deal with vulnerable customers, and how open are they to new technology, new ways of working, new processes?
So I would say everybody's trying their best to kind of approach this in the right way and to make sure they're looking after the customers. But I think in a lot of instances, they approach it from the wrong angle. So they're approaching it from a compliance first angle of making sure that, the right questions are asked, making sure that they're taking as little risk as possible. But there's still only, I believe it's 4 out of every 10 customers that are vulnerable that are being identified properly as they're going through some of these journeys. So I think the compliance bit's good. I would like to see more education of customers over actually what they can get for being vulnerable, the fact that there's so many people who are vulnerable, the fact that it's a situation and not a label. And I think that the government, firstly, and then the organisations, secondly, are still falling short of that education piece. So I would say, look, trying hard, putting a lot of steps in, but approaching it from a compliance lens as opposed to an education and understanding lens, I still think means that a lot of people are kind of falling short of that.
Thanks, Owen. I think some of that comes down to what we talked about before, wasn't it? Which is it's not a compliance tick box. This isn't about reducing your risk because you may get into trouble as a business.
I think it's more than that, Lian. I think going back to the FCA's view on consumer duty reports, year 1 was this was compliance driven.
Yeah.
Year 2 was actually there's ownership by the directors of the firm, and it's about operationalizing compliance.
Yes.
Year 3 is how is this embedded across the whole organization? So if you go in colloquial terms and you ask a bloke in a pub, have they noticed a difference around the adoption of Consumer Duty and the vulnerability guidance? I'd still say the vast majority of consumers would say, no, I haven't noticed a difference. And with the overlay of AI by consumers, particularly with buy now, pay later coming in July,
Of course, yeah.
where affordability checks come in,
Yeah.
and engagement, and the fact that 30% may now get rejected now under the new regime, consumers may vote with their feet, which is, I actually don't see how this has benefited me.
Yeah.
What I see is a lot of firms putting barriers or blockers in place. Where's the innovation and the safeguards so that this actually helps me? And the government talk about growth, but most consumers don't see growth. They see a Gulf War, they see more cost.
Yeah.
How is all this affecting me? Because most of these now seem to be blockers in the day-to-day engagement that I have,
Yeah.
and the response times I get from contact centres, and the quality of service I get. And that's not just in financial services, the NHS, government.
Of course.
It's across the board.
Can I just add something to that as well?
Steve, coming back to you in terms of the report, what was the next point on the report for you?
Yeah, so it's identifying vulnerability. So we asked our hundreds of contact centres what they were having issues with in terms of, serving vulnerable customers. And something that came up quite a lot was the inability to identify actual vulnerability, and customers really weren't particularly forthcoming about this. Now, that might be because they don't know there's any sort of differential service available, or it might just be that they don't want to admit what we call weakness. So this is, it depends on your type of customer, obviously, but this is definitely an issue that was flagged up by a lot of people. So we looked at a few ways here that we could potentially use AI either now or in the future to kind of help with this particular issue, because until you can't serve a vulnerable customer until you know that they're vulnerable and in which way that they are, and then apply appropriate measures. So looked here. One option is proactive identification through predictive data analysis. Okay, that's kind of a bit of a wordy way of looking at it, but it's like, let's look at it. Means don't just ask the customer or wait for the customer to say something. It's about, let's have a look at that, the customer in their entirety. What's their spending patterns look like? What's their contact patterns looking like? What sort of things are they talking about? And then make some kind of predictions, inferences based on that, to give some kind of a score of likelihood, perhaps, that these people might need to be treated differently. Probably the most obvious one really is kind of real-time analytics within calls, so not relying on the agent to actually notice particular words that are being spoken, or rather working in tandem with the agents to have a greater level of certainty that what the customer is actually experiencing and going through. Behavioral journey analysis for digital and voice channels. So that really means trying to make the customer journey easier. People with certain vulnerabilities may find parts of a website extremely difficult to navigate. People with other perhaps speech difficulties may find the voice channels particularly awkward. They may need longer to speak to an agent to identify themselves. So really try to use AI and understand from a customer's perspective in very many different ways how they are experiencing the customer journey, and then try to improve it. And building on what Kev said before, we have the kind of intelligent routing and prioritization, and that will be increasingly done through voice bots, which are able to understand context and able to understand exactly what the customer wants, rather than just picking out keywords or press 1 for this or 2 for that.
I think that's really interesting with the identification of vulnerability. I'm actually going to come to Owen next, because I think this is really quite a fascinating one from a human perspective. Obviously, your agents deal with people with vulnerability all the time. What I'm keen to understand before we move on to the technology, how technology can help, is actually what, from your perspective, are the signs that agents can notice that aren't necessarily somebody saying, I'm vulnerable or I can't hear you. What is it that your agents look for, and what do they pick up that suggests the customer might need a different type of approach in order for them to be helped?
So we put a lot of effort into making sure that we've got the right training modules for the advisors. The stuff that we focus on is there any communication barriers, even that could be hesitation or confusion with the information that's been relayed to them, any emotional or behavioural cues, any disclosure of life events, any kind of capability or accessibility barriers. I think one thing that does get lost and isn't often put into this bucket is process friction signals. So the person keeps having to phone up to get a simple issue resolved. And I think a lot of the times that's viewed as it could be a system problem, or it could just be the person not understanding. But I think that can be a key indicator of vulnerability. If the person keeps having to repeat their contact, or they keep having the same problem happening in their account. But we try and get the advisors to put themselves in the customer's shoes and think, well, where are examples of times that you've went through something similar, or somebody that you know's went through something similar? But I think the process friction signals is the one that we try and major on, that I think a lot of people miss.
I think, I think that's the challenge, that when we have these conversations that we need to kind of dig into a bit deeper, which is a lot of that is intuition. And it's the intuition that we ask the agents we try and teach them, to layer onto their natural intuition. What are you picking up from this call? What are you picking up from this conversation that needs to be done? I'm going to come to you, James, on that one, which is where can technology augment or assist that side of things, or indeed almost, do that for us? How do we enable that?
I think the first thing is to be clear about what we're asking the AI to do. So if we deploy AI to find or identify vulnerability, that's its goal. That's what it's going to do on probably every interaction. It will find something, some tick that says this customer is now vulnerable, because that's what we've asked it to do. I think more realistically, what we should be doing is asking AI to assist to get the customer to the correct outcome for them.
Yeah.
And that's where we can use AI to help with the identification of vulnerability, and whether it's having that a direct interaction, whether the AI is interacting with the customer directly, or whether it's assisting a human agent to understand or pick up on things. I think that's where the technology comes into play. So if it is having a direct interaction with the customer, coming back to kind of the process and data and having a very tight definition of vulnerability, that's going to help the AI in the background think this customer is showing characteristics of being in a vulnerable situation, and then it can potentially identify that to a human, or it can continue to kind of quantify and validate those assumptions that it's made around vulnerability, and determine then, based on your existing processes, what track it should take the customer down. And that's the other thing, when we're talking about what the AI should do, and coming back to the data and process, you need to make sure that you are very confident in the data that you have and the processes that you have, because AI is only ultimately going to automate what you already have. So if you have a bad process, it's just going to automate the bad process. So be very clear about what outcomes you want to achieve with the customer, the type of service and the experience that you want them to have, and then the AI can assist you to kind of get there and scale it up.
Yeah,
Lian, on just on this point, one of the areas that particularly in financial services is converging here, particularly around financial crime, scams and fraud. So particularly this is driven in the public sector. But if you are going to look at some of the new vulnerabilities, so coerced debt, economic abuse is one of those. Is the person you got on the phone subject to something else going on in their life? Loan sharks we're seeing a lot more of in the economy that we're dealing with. So when you're looking at some of these technologies, are you looking at deepfake, which is quite a common challenge now, which is undermining some of the identity and verification tools? So firms are still pigeonholing their money laundering check with their KYC check, with their customer due diligence. What you're often finding is I've got some really good information over here. Why aren't I using this over here in my agent engagement? So those two strands are coming together very strongly in a number of sectors. And this is where some of the AI tooling around, particularly fraud, is more advanced than it is probably in the customer service space. But that I see is a big direction change, certainly over the next 12 months.
And the other thing to consider, I guess, is that we're talking about identifying vulnerability, and that's great, and we should be aware of it, but we don't want to identify it, try with the intention of being empathetic, but end up insulting
Absolutely.
the customer. Just because I may be in a set of vulnerable circumstances doesn't mean that I want to be considered vulnerable as a customer. I might be perfectly capable of getting myself through whatever circumstances I'm currently in, and I don't want to be treated any differently. Versus, some customers may not know how to ask for support, so that we need to be able to understand what support to offer, when to offer it, I suppose.
I think that combines with Owen's conversation, really, which is about education and letting people know what help is out there so they can choose to have it. And I know a lot of the work you do with vulnerability registration service, Kev, is very relevant to that as well, which is I know that I have certain vulnerabilities, so therefore I will ask for help because I know it's there.
It is about moment in time, though, Lian. So, I would raise this question straight up. If you've got over 1 million records, whether that be from Support Hub, VRS, or any other source, why is it not being used to help the agent when somebody has disclosed on a tell me once basis, I've got dyslexia?
Yep.
Does that impede my ability to manage my money? Probably not. Do I have to communicate with that person in a different way? So when you see people that do experience that and how they read complex text, for example, you can change that medium.
Absolutely.
Similar journey, but you're just engaging in a slightly different way. So why on earth don't we empower the agent with that to help that journey, enhance that journey? And the same is true in an affordability crisis. If you've already shared your affordability, particularly going back to deferred payment credit, that I've already keeping this up to date, I'm being proactive, I'm doing something positively, and your expectation is your provider, could be a broadband provider, lender, gas provider, whatever it may be. Why aren't you looking at that information? Why aren't you giving the agent that little bit of an advantage to be able to use that information properly? Because that's not necessarily about data quality on your own CRM.
No.
It's information that's been shared to a common standard. And that, particularly in the work that I do, we're about to have a new document come out tomorrow, which is around best practice in vulnerability, which is around support needs. And this is not necessarily about drilling into vulnerability. It's about what support need I have. And things like the priority service register, we're now beginning to get into the space of auto enrollment.
Yeah.
And this is a world of difference when you've got somebody like a water company sharing data with the same local authority, DWP, and suddenly the agent can see you're entitled to that social tariff. You're entitled to this. I can now build that into my dialogue with the clients and talk about some nice things, positives.
Yeah.
And I think that other thing, to James's point on education, is let's use these tailored journeys to up them. So it's not a debt recovery call. It's not a negative customer service call. It's building in some things at the right moment in time that are educational when it is important to that particular client.
Absolutely. Owen, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to kind of add to that. So, like, if you think about the journey that most people go through when they're trying to make a phone call when they're vulnerable, it's quite hard to get to the right person. And it's not very often that you've got specific vulnerability teams that are well signposted. Kev was talking about there just the ability for advisors to see kind of what benefits people are able to get. So, right, you know that somebody's vulnerable, we've identified them, they're eligible for these types of benefits. I would say that the tools that I have seen in the industry that are able to quantify the benefits for an advisor to be able to easily relay them back to a customer are not really great at this point in time. And if I use a comparison to the tools that you've got in order to compare the things that you want to sell to a customer, there's a huge difference in the capability that an advisor has to make a sale versus actually to identify and support somebody with vulnerability. And I think until the industry closes that gap, we'll continue to have poor service for people that are vulnerable.
Absolutely. Agreed. Steve, just conscious of time, coming back to you really, if we move on to the third point, which I think was measurements and KPIs.
Yeah, that's right. So we've tracked these data for a long time now, since 2004, looking at speed to answer and call abandonment rate is what we're looking at here. And as you can see, the speed to answer, which is along with first contact resolution, is one of the two main drivers of customer experience. you can see there that, during the pandemic, it kind of lost the plot a bit, which is understandable, but it's not really actually come back down very much. Now, obviously, speed to answer and call abandonment track each other fairly closely. The longer you wait, the more people are going to give up on the call. So, customers of all flavors are looking at, historically very high wait times. There's 111 seconds there. You think, oh, that's only 2 minutes. That's not, not even 2 minutes, nothing to worry about. But that's the mean average. There's some that are really pretty spectacular and measured in, best part of an hour, if not more. So, speed to answer 4 times higher than pre-pandemic. Average handle time at just over 7 minutes is 92% higher than 2004. So a lot more complex calls, difficult calls. So really kind of service design is key. What can we do? Handle time isn't seen as the most vital statistic to be measured anymore, but it does impact on other things. It impacts on your queue time, which does matter. It impacts on abandonment rate, stress for customers waiting. So what can we do within the call to use AI to actually kind of trim that? Then I'm not going to go into it now because of time, but within the report, there are numerous ways in which, we can improve that without damaging customer experience. And basically getting agents back into the queue so they can start taking more calls.
Thanks, Steve. For me, that's one of I found that one of the key kind of tenets of the report as I've read it, which is that conflict between KPIs that may be in place from whether it's from an agent perspective or from a client and supplier perspective, versus the outcomes that we actually need. And I think particularly as we implement AI more into customer journeys, those conversations that we expect agents to have are going to be more complex. They're going to be more emotionally draining. They're going to be much more, require much more information to get to the right outcome for customers. I think if I was to come to you, Kev, when we're looking for good outcomes for a vulnerable customer, I guess if you were redesigning a scorecard to say what does a good call look like, what would you kind of remove and add from a sort of KPI perspective? What would you take away and throw away, and what would you bring in?
Well, first up, I would turn around and say all of those are introspective metrics. So in the world we live in, particularly in financial services, they have to be through a consumer lens, so outside in.
Yeah.
So if you're not looking at what the call intent was, then you're doomed. So first up, what are the journey? Why did the client call you in the first place? Did they achieve the outcome they want? So if it's public sector, I called in to change my tax code. Did you achieve that? Or if you're in financial services, I've called into my insurance company because I want to take a car off my multi-car, and the chatbot didn't allow me to do it. I can add a car, but I can't take a car off. And this, where we're talking about sludge practices in FCA terms, that's where we're coming at it. So it's got to be outside in.
Yeah.
That would be the first thing. And the planks that sit within product design, so that's the first part of the 4 interlocking, cross-cutting pieces. So product design, fair value, consumer support, consumer understanding. So those have to be integrated together. So if you've designed a product, and let's say it's a 0-star insurance product, rather than the 5-star one, what's the difference? Do you not get the gold standard telephony support?
Yeah.
What promise are you making on the consumer support? And is the product really the claim? And is the claims handling part of it up to the job?
Yeah.
So before you even start talking about AI, you've got to look at that when you look at your proposition, particularly for the products that were there before, like a mortgage, a credit card, that have had to come across the border with the consumer duty. And suddenly you find you're on a mortgage from 1997 and consumer duty wasn't invented. And even then, the treating customers fairly was fairly embryonic. So there are a number of areas at the moment that when you rethink it, dabbling doesn't work. Some of these things you've got to turn around and see this product's actually not fit for purpose anymore, whereas these ones are, and we can adapt it. It's that service layer that sits around it and the expectation, which is where AI augmentation really comes into play. But if you're not involving consumers, so the inclusive co-design bit, and it's not a token person who's in a back room that comes out once in a blue moon every leap year, this is genuinely how do you bring consumers into it? Because a lot of these consumers are pretty savvy when you start looking at how they engage on their smartphone. There are a few people that are financially excluded or excluded from technology, but the vast majority are digitally enabled, but they haven't had a say in how they design the product.
Absolutely.
So that part of it is a quantum change when you look at it and said, this engagement between the agent and the consumer, particularly if it gets to AI, which we can all envisage, particularly in complaint handling. So it was only, I think last week, the financial ombudsman said 33% of cases are now coming through where ChatGPT or the equivalent. So you've got maybe an unsavvy consumer on the phone, but you then suddenly get something that's referencing the Magna Carta that comes through when they actually complain. So those are the challenges, I think, at the moment. It's not just about the introspective stuff. You've got to come at it with the consumer lens in mind.
Fully agree. Very quickly, Owen, I am just going to come to you on this one, because I think as somebody with significant operations in this space, I'm just curious, really, which is if you had the opportunity from an introspective perspective, if you're not, I'm thinking about from if you're a BPO and you're operating, you've got your KPIs that you need to meet for your client perspective. Oh, and if I was to wave a magic wand and say, which ones would you completely throw out and which ones would you like to be measured on, what would you change?
I don't know if I would throw any out. I would say that you can every KPI is imperfect. It's about how you design the system round about the KPI to make sure that it's done properly. So like if I take AHT, which is I would say would normally be considered the metric that drives the worst behaviour, I think as long as the advisors are in a good environment where they're scheduled properly, you've planned the AHT at 15-minute increments, you've planned the call volumes at 15-minute increments, you've got some level of flexibility inside your WFM practices, you've got good training, good sizing. I think any KPI can work well, but I think ultimately you want the one that's going to do what Kev said, it's going to give the customer exactly what they wanted when they called up. And I think doing that as quickly and as efficiently as possible is the thing that we need to be able to measure. So I would say resolution times, AHT is still a valid measure. It's about making sure that it doesn't stand in the way of getting the right outcome for the customer.
Fair enough. Just aware of time, Steve, the last one I think was role of agents and the key role of the agent.
Yeah, that's right. So what we did is we asked our 200 plus contact centers what the greatest challenges were around supporting vulnerable customers. Big long list there, and all of them relevant. So really just trying to get the idea about what's keeping people awake at night with this. And as you can see there, the one at the bottom, agent training and skill development, that gets the most number of first votes and also the most number of top threes. So key role of the agent. So it's not all about technology, as we've all talked about. Just a bit of background, agents are handling, as we've seen, longer, more complex and more emotional calls, and this is only going to increase. You can use AI within the call to support the agent with in-call prompts, but it's not the case of envisaging seeing the agent being told exactly what to do by this or omniscient AI. That's not the case. They work together. Talked about vulnerability disclosure and how we can use AI in order to kind of help that process along. And I think as well, Owen talked before about, training the agents, coaching them. And I think, auto QA and coaching to identify the gaps is going to become a particularly important thing. And as we saw there, the KPIs, yes, I totally agree with what Kev's saying, going beyond traditional metrics, but I also agree with what Owen is saying. You can't throw everything out and move completely differently. It's adding more metrics, understanding what they're doing, and basically, making sure that somebody, the organization or the agent isn't kind of gaming the system and to say, yes, we've hit this metric and therefore we've done what we want to. It needs to be about customer outcomes, of course.
Thanks, Steve. In terms of the whole report, that's the part that I absolutely focused on, and I think it really is a bit of a soapbox topic of mine. Obviously, that's a quick run through of the findings on the report. The report goes into a lot more depth, so please do visit the website, download it. There is so much great information in there. The thing about the slide that Steve just showed up there is that there are all of these reasons why agents, all of the reasons why people find it difficult to have these conversations in the first place. Things like a reluctance to disclose vulnerability as a starting point, but all of the different, reasons why agents have this complex relationship with customers when we're asking them to do these things. We know that we rely very heavily on agent empathy. I'm actually going to come to you first, James, on this one, which is, what have we got in our toolkit that can really, really, and I said that our toolkit as in what is in the AI toolkit that exists available at the moment, that can really, really support agents as we ask them, like we talked about before, as we ask them to do much more difficult calls, handle much more emotional calls, much more complexity, without just kind of scripting empathy. How do we avoid that whilst supporting them properly?
I think in the initial kind of use cases for AI are going to be, or what it's going to be able to deliver in the initial use cases are consistency and scale. We need to be very clear about what we're asking it to be consistent at before we scale it up. Once we have that, and that's a very human input that we need to give to the AI. Once we have that, then it becomes using that scale. So going back to some of the points that you made before, Kev, about having all of that data that's available to us, external factors, internal data that we hold on customers, the AI can pick up on all of those factors in various different combinations to determine if a customer is potentially in a set of vulnerable circumstances. You can do that instantaneously without a human needing to go to individual screens, look at individual fields to try and to kind of gauge that for themselves. And then it can combine that with what's actually happening in a live interaction to kind of say, right, the customer has now said this, that combined with all these other factors suggests that they may be in this particular set of circumstances. And then it can then guide the agent in real time to kind of either qualify that or take them down a particular process and prompt them to kind of go down a particular process, bring that process to the fore. So it can be literally step by step. I know you don't want to script conversation necessarily, but you may have a predefined process for a very specific set of circumstances that you need an agent to follow to the letter. Yeah. In which case the AI can then guide the agent through that and bring them back, if they deviate from the process, back into the process as well.
Yeah, just building on that, so just specifically talking about the spaces I'm working in at the moment, we've just worked on a project that's been funded by the Money and Pension Service about building an LLM for the debt advice sector, designed specifically for debt advisors. So they've got effectively a single source of the truth, where the FCA handbook, the Money and Pension Service standards are all built to give consumers, as well as the agents, confidence that the material that's been talked about is accurate. And particularly there, that when you reference it, when you write up, whether you're using ChatGPT or not to write up the suitability letter, you can evidence the source of where that information's come from. So when you look at things like the drills that have been around since the dawn of time, these are often still stuck to the side of somebody's screen. Yeah. But how you embed them, that says you're going to go into the right drill, whether it's Texas that most people are familiar with, or at the other end of the extreme, something around suicide, yeah, or mental capacity. These are the areas at the moment that AI is rapidly being adopted, where a combination of agentic and the sort of conversational chat GPT type tools, making sure that you've got key reference points written in a language that is understandable by the consumer. So when you look at tools like Amplify Global, Plain Numbers that are now out there, recognizing that 50% of the population allegedly have a reading age of 11 and a numeracy level of 11. But as James said, lots of people don't. So it will be insulting to me when you look at some of the adverts on TV and everything's got down to Janet and John level. You switch off for the reasons actually this has been pitched at the wrong level. So the technology is now there with things like call transcription and AI to say, let's pitch this at the right level, yeah, to the person I've got on the other end of the telephone. And it's become very apparent this person is very savvy. Yeah. So talk to them as if they're very savvy. Do not, insult somebody's intelligence. And conversely, when it becomes very apparent that you're going to have to go through in single bite-sized chunks, and that technology is there ready, and a lot of the firms that Fornet engage with are already adopting that strategy, where they've got 100% view across all transactions, and they've been able to prioritize the consumer cohorts that you need to actually intervene with, probably where you've got a lack of engagement, where better engagement would deliver better outcomes.
Fabulous. Thank you. I'm just aware of time. Do we have any questions in the chat at the moment, Rod? No. So I'm going to just finish off, I think, by coming to each of you with a bit of a key question, really, one in turn. And I'm going to actually start with Steve. Steve, you wrote the report. This is, you are very, very close to the data on this. The question is, what is the one practical change that you would like to see organizations make in the next 12 months to support outcomes for vulnerable customers?
Okay, well, I'm going to be a bit awkward here. I'm not going to talk about data. I'm not going to talk about technology. I'd say that, organizations need to understand that, serving vulnerable customers is no longer just about compliance, but it also has a very definite commercial edge to it if you get it right. And that might look very obvious. Obviously the happy customer is, a more profitable customer. What I'm actually talking about here is, I'm putting myself in the place here. My mum's 80. And although she's doing very well, I think that if she were to tell me about a bad experience that she'd had with a bank or any sort of organization, and how it upset her, and she didn't felt she'd been treated fairly, I think that would impact me more strongly than if it had happened to me myself. Yeah. So I think you've got this amplification that organizations maybe don't understand. So if a vulnerable customer goes and talks to their social circle, their social group, their family, their friends, whatever, I think that could have a very negative effect, or indeed positive advocacy effect, if they manage to get it right. So I think it's something, move it away from the compliance, understand the commercial, and then kind of commercial plus. So
brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, Steve. And I agree 100%. I absolutely agree with that 100%. I'm going to come to Owen next. Owen, what would be the one thing that you would like to see change?
So I would like to see better workforce segmentation so that vulnerability is handled as its own separate kind of line in the call centre, with less wait times, higher HT, more specialised advisors. I think that'd make a massive difference.
Again, that would be absolutely perfect. I'd love to see that. James, what about you?
I'm just going to come this purely from an AI adoption perspective. I think the one thing I would love to see change, or maybe kind of two things because they're kind of interlinked. One is data and process, making sure that everyone is comfortable that what we already have today is fit for purpose. I'm being really honest about that. I think there are a lot of processes in there that have just been in there for a long time, and it's very hard to kind of redevelop them, re-engineer them, and implement them again, regardless of whether we're talking about AI or not. So that's the first thing. And then be very clear about what we're asking the AI to do. Yeah. Be very clear about that, not just using AI for AI's sake, because it's doomed to fail at that point.
Totally agree. And Kev?
So my soapbox, I think, practically, I mentioned right at the very beginning, so I'll say it at the end, building trust is vital. Yeah. So the tooling that fits around that. So Fornet, I think, is exhibiting at the VRS conference on the 7th of May. One of the things that's been showcased there is the vulnerability passport that is using established technology like blockchain to enable where a consumer has decided to share and disclose, which is a big decision. And some of the information you've got there from Money and Mental Health and others suggest it's patchy as to where people will do it, organisation and sector by sector. But if they've made that attempt, why on earth would you not then make that information available? If they've consented to it, build that trust so they feel comfortable they will get better outcomes by disclosing that information and have the right to be forgotten. And at the moment, we're nowhere near where we need to be, where consumers have voluntarily disclosed something and you're encouraging them. So one organisation, your bank, may be asking to do it, but then your energy provider or your other providers don't recognise it at all. Yeah. So to me, consumer trust, particularly where AI adoption's growing, but they still do not trust the corporates, enterprise organisations and their intent in AI usage. It's got to have some consumer benefits. They've got to be brought along on the journey.
I think you're so right. I think trust and intent is absolutely vital. And I think, if we can gain that and we can persuade people to give us information that is then used across the board to improve their journeys, regardless of what they're trying to achieve, regardless of what the outcome that they're looking for, I think we'll all be in a much better place.
Open source technology, I think, particularly where, when you're dealing with guys, in the technology space like James, knowing this is easy to integrate as an API that is evergreen is where everybody should be at the moment. But how often do we find that there is a blocker that my API doesn't talk to your API? And we've got to overcome those barriers. And often there are commercial reasons why that doesn't happen. And the consumer will never understand that this is an anti-competitive issue rather than it necessarily being a technical enablement.
Absolutely. I am aware that we are at the top of time. So I would very much like to thank everybody on the panel. So huge thanks to Steve from Contact Babel, huge thanks to Owen from Cura, to Kevin, and to James. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed the last hour. I think it's been, we could have honestly gone on for at least another 30, 45 minutes. There's lots and lots of information in the report that can be downloaded from the 4Net website. Feel free to reach out to anybody on the panel if you've got any questions of anything that you've heard today. I'm sure we'd all be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has got. So thanks very much. Thanks to everybody who is online watching for your time. Thanks again to the panel for your time. And we will put this recording up on the website so that people can watch at their leisure. Thanks very much, everybody.